hotels have become a hub of activity for human trafficking, which is why my ministry, alongside the Ministry of Attorney General, the Solicitor General, and the Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, brought forward new anti-human trafficking legislation this week that will build off of our $307 million commitment to support vulnerable girls and women. This emanated from legislation early on during my opposition days with the Honorable Laurie Scott, who brought forward something called the Girl Next Door Act to highlight the sex trafficking that is happening across Ontario. When I was Women's Minister in the previous portfolio, I led a national conversation with the Minister of Status of Women federally, as well as my provincial and territorial colleagues on this issue, and also had the ability to travel to the United Nations to speak on behalf of Canada about sex trafficking with the Vatican. And so this work is really important. I call this Ontario's dirty little secret. And I say so because for many years, we really haven't seen this national conversation that's required. And girls as young as 11 have been victimized as a result of being preyed upon and groomed into sex trafficking. And so if you don't think it's happening here, think again. It's happening at Bayshore. It's happened to girls who've gone to Algonquin College. It could happen to any child in any community across Ontario. And that's why we are bringing measures in place that will support this legislation and these vulnerable women.
But when I became the minister responsible for tourism, I felt I had an obligation to work with our tourism and hospitality sector and our meeting and convention centers in order to bring this to light, because it's happening in every single hotel, as I said, and Ontario is a hub. Our hotels, our resorts, our motels, and short-term accommodations are places where some of these victims are hidden. And so we've been able to work with the sector to help identify what might a victim look like, what might a perpetrator look like, and protocols in place in order for us to work with the victim-led services as well as our police departments. And so I'm pleased to be working on this as one of the 4 ministers on a government, whole of government approach to anti-human trafficking. As Rick said, we had a comprehensive $377 million anti-trafficking strategy that was launched last year. And the legislation that is, if passed, would do a number of things. The proposed legislation would support a long-term provincial response to human trafficking and emphasize that all Ontarians have a role to play in combating human trafficking, because we are talking about vulnerable women who are victimized over a very long period of time. We want to strengthen the ability of children's aid societies and law enforcement to protect exploited children. We want to increase the government's ability to collect non-personal data to better understand and respond to human trafficking. And we would like to provide law enforcement with more tools to locate victims and charge traffickers by increasing penalties for traffickers who interfere with a child in the care of a children's aid society. In my portfolio, we're going to clarify how and when police services can access information from hotel guest registries to help deter trafficking and identify and locate victims, while establishing a regulation making authority to include other types of accommodation providers. And we want to require companies that advertise sexual services to have a dedicated contact to support investigations into suspected human trafficking. And so that's why today the proposed legislation that we are bringing forward, the Anti-Human Trafficking Strategy Act 2021, and the compendium from my ministry, the Accommodation Sector Registration of Guests Act 2021, as well as amendments to the Child and Youth and Family Services Act of 2017 and the Prevention and Remedies for Human Trafficking Act 2017, will be part of a major legislation push over the next couple of weeks for us to provide more support for victims and also provide greater abilities for our law enforcement to get the information that they need. The greater child protection through our Children's Aid Society is also important. So some of the measures that we're undertaking will be supporting a long-term provincial response to human trafficking and emphasizing that all Ontarians have a role to play in combating human trafficking. We will be strengthening the ability of children's aid societies and law enforcement to protect exploited children. Again, I remind you that children as young as 11 in Ontario have been exploited into human trafficking. We want to make sure that we are supporting more survivors and the people who support them in obtaining restraining orders against traffickers, with specific considerations for our Indigenous survivors. We will be increasing the government's ability to collect non-personal data to better understand and respond to human trafficking. And we will be providing law enforcement with more tools to locate victims and charge traffickers. And we will be doing this by increasing penalties for traffickers who interfere with a child in the care of the children's aid societies. We will clarify when and how police services can access information from hotel guest registries to help deter trafficking and identify and locate victims, while establishing regulation making authority to include other types of accommodation providers. And finally, we will require companies that advertise sexual services to have a dedicated contact to support investigations into suspected human trafficking. As I said, this is an all government approach, and that is why the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Cultural Industries are involved. It is also an all Ontario approach. Each one of us has an obligation to protect these young women and girls from sex trafficking. And that's why it's important that the people we have here today lead on victim services and law enforcement and our hotel and accommodation sector. And I want to thank them, each of them, for their strong and dedicated leadership to protecting young women and girls across Ontario. I now